All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Unapologetic Apologists. Today we're going to be addressing and reviewing parts from the T-Jump versus Liz Jackson debate. Tom Jump had Liz Jackson on his show to discuss Pascal's wager, whether or not it was a good argument, and there were some specific points in the debate that I wanted to highlight and discuss. But before I do that, I want to introduce David Paulman, who is here to help me review. David, how are you doing, sir?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on, Stillman.
Absolutely. You've been on the channel before, but just in case there's somebody who hasn't seen you before, maybe tell them just a little bit about yourself, about your YouTube channel, and where they can find that to subscribe.
Sure, yeah. I have a YouTube channel called Faith Because of Reason, mostly apologetic and theological material there. Haven't been uploading a whole lot lately just because I'm trying to do better quality videos and not necessarily get them out there quick. So, but I try to have quality videos, and I think that that's ultimately more important than having more videos.
Yeah, but you haven't been appearing. I've seen you on some channels doing debates. You've been on JMD's show a couple of times. So yeah, you're out there working, and there is a link to David's channel in the description, so people can go there and subscribe. So I won't take too much time before we get into the debate. I do want to kind of give the prerequisite because we're kind of jumping into the middle here. So basically, Liz, and she'll be coming on the channel soon to talk about Pascal's wager, about faith, about religious experience, and that kind of stuff. But she has written a couple of papers on Pascal's wager, and she gives a rather unique version of it. And go check out on T-Jump's channel for yourself the video. He doesn't really disagree with her on her form of Pascal's wager. She kind of sets it up as, as an individual, you have to choose what you value. And if you think the afterlife is something worth valuing, then you should try to live in a way, you should wager on living a way that's going to get you to the afterlife, assuming that it's good, or even if there's a good versus a bad one, you should try to get to the good one. And T-Jump doesn't even disagree with that. What he's going to disagree with, and we see this a lot in T-Jump's arguments, where he'll say something like naturalistic pantheism or something else can explain the evidence just as well as God can, that if all you have competing explanations and they're all equally as likely to explain the data, then you can't really say one is right over the other or come to a conclusion about one over the other. And so what he's going to do with regarding to Pascal's wagers, we're going to see is he's going to say, oh, sure, we should try to live in a way that would get us to a good afterlife, but we can't actually know which way of all ways of living are equally as likely to get you there. But before I can continue and just make his argument for him, I'm going to go there and allow him to make it himself. No, not that one, this one.
But one question I have for you is, do you think atheists are just as likely to go to heaven as theists, or as people that commit their lives to God and make big sacrifices for God and pursue God? Do you think it's this equal probability that atheists go to heaven, and that like we can take theists that make serious sacrifices for God?
Yes, I would say that.
Probability of going to heaven. Okay.
Yeah, I'd say that we have no evidence to conclude what the ultimate nature of reality is, whether it's a God or a natural thing, whether it's a heaven or not. And the probability that any one particular action or set of actions is likely to get you into that heaven is no more or less probable than any other set of actions. So picking your nose on a Tuesday is equally as likely to get you into heaven as devoting your life to Jesus.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, I mean, you're alluding to this thing, it's called the mixed strategies objection, and it's just saying Pascal's wager gives all decisions the same expected value, but that objection is based on this idea that you take the probability and you multiply it by infinity, and then they're all just infinite. And so that's why I gave the game show analogy, because it's supposed to show like probability matters. And what I think you're coming back and saying is, oh, but like the probability of all of those is just exactly the same. And that's a view. You can totally have that view. And honestly, the entire paper that I wrote that I was talking about earlier, that's not going to touch that. But part of what we were sort of pushing is, if you do have this view that theists are more likely to go to heaven than atheists, we can, we're not saying you have to have that view or anything, but if you do have that view, then you should be a theist, for example. So you're basically just saying, I just think any action is just as likely to send you to heaven as any other action. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly
So
right.
like even murdering, like
Yep.
spending your life like Jeffrey Dahmer versus like Mother Teresa, you think they're equally likely to go to heaven?
Yes, I think that it's equally as likely there is a God that would reward moral actions that we see as moral versus a God that would reward immoral actions. So it's equally as likely that Mother Teresa would be allowed into heaven as Hitler or something, because we have no reason to conclude anything about if there was a heaven, what would it be like, or if there was a God, what would it be like. The properties of its nature are essentially ambiguous. We can just pick, maybe it has this property, and that is equally as likely as just pick any other alternative negation of that.
I mean,
So that's the first clip. And so just to get into it, he's saying, okay, so he's agreeing that, okay, maybe we should try to live in a way that's going to get you to an afterlife, assuming that there's a God that can get you there. Now, as he'll say later, as we continue in the clip, he'll say it doesn't even necessarily need to be a God, which how a natural foundation could have a heaven or a hell and reward you in some kind of way is beyond me. But sticking with this part, he's saying that for all we know, and now granted, he's assuming we don't know anything about God. Right now, of course, it's going to be very different if you think you do have evidence for God and you think you do have evidence for Christianity. Of course, that's going to obviously make certain actions seem more probable to get you into heaven and not. But putting that aside for the moment, he's saying if we don't know anything about God, then we don't know what he'd reward. But to me, that just, on the face of it, I mean, just think for yourself and just kind of use your intuitions to probe that a little bit. This seems highly unlikely that you would assign those different things with the same probability. And I'm not going to say too much right now, because as we play through the clip, he'll make more explicit claims that will make it easier to kind of give an evaluation of his epistemology here. But just to start at a very baseline level, try to use your intuition and think, okay, if I'm going to try to get into heaven, why would I assume morality is not tied to that? Right? Why would you think, like, what is the likelihood, just using your own intuition, that there would be a God who rewards picking your nose or rewards murdering people? Now, obviously, I'll make arguments to that effect later, but just for right now, let's start by just using your intuition. I think that's highly unlikely. David, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And I was just thinking as I was listening to that clip, I'm not sure if I'm using the right philosophical law here, but there's something, I think it's called the law of analogy, which would be at least according to some people, a self-evident first principle, according to which causes produce effects like unto themselves. And so I would have to just disagree with TJ if that principle that is correct and I'm understanding it correctly. And again, I'm not a philosopher, so I could be wrong on that. But if the principle of analogy, or the law of analogy as I'm understanding it, is correct, then actually we could understand that we would have some reasons for thinking that if God existed, that he would want us to live morally as opposed to killing people, because we have moral intuitions, we have a sense of morality. And so based on the law of analogy, then it would make a lot more sense to believe that we would be like a creator God, in the sense that he would also consider the same sorts of things good and right that we would, at least generally speaking.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because as he'll say later, is why do we assume morality is tied into what gets in the afterlife? But if you're going to ask that question, I think you could just easily ask the question, well, if morality doesn't get you in the afterlife, if God isn't concerned with you behaving morally, why build us with a moral sense? Like, even like in any Christian philosophy, or in any, even just say theistic philosophy, we kind of understand that there's an idea of there's something separate about humans than animals, right? And usually we know it's to behave morally. And in any religious tradition, that plays a role. Now, of course, different religious traditions are going to consider different things moral. But that's like kind of like the baseline of any religious tradition is there's something different about humans, and there's a moral aspect to it. And so like different religions think you have to do different things to get to God, but it all has to do with morality, something that separates us from animals. And so if we're recognize, again, using our intuitions to recognize, okay, there's something different about humans. This is obviously every religious tradition playing a role in how you get to the afterlife. And so if God is creating humans with an additional thing that's supposed to get them into the afterlife, and it's not to behave morally, it seems highly unlikely that he would even give us a moral instinct in the first place. I think it seems he would give us a murderous instinct, or as T-Jump will say later, an instinct to pick our nose on a Tuesday. So it just seems really absurd on the face of it. But we'll go and we'll play the next about the next minute of this video, and then respond to that part.
So you're kind of alluding to indifference principles, which is that sort of before we have evidence or before we look at something, we should assign P and not P both like 50-50 probability, right?
Yep.
But I think we have some evidence that there's a sense in which like Mother Teresa is morally better or deserves a reward or something good, and someone like Hitler or Jeffrey Dahmer does not. And so even if a priori we're using these indifference principles, I think we can learn moral truths and kind of make moral judgments about other people, such that it's more likely or someone's more deserving of heaven than someone else. So maybe you just deny that, I guess?
Well, no, I totally agree with that, but I would say that if we assume there is a God or a heaven, we also have to assume that the entry conditions for this God or heaven are morality. Like those aren't necessarily linked. So I agree Mother Teresa is more moral, given Christopher Hitchens doesn't like her very much. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything related to heaven or the reward. Like, what are the conditions to get the reward? Well, we don't know. So it wouldn't be reasonable to conclude that, well, we like this person better and think this person should be rewarded, therefore the God does too. That doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so I do want to go off that a little bit, because we kind of just talked about that, right? If he's going to just assume morality isn't tied to it, it's like, okay, well then why were humans created with a moral compass, right? Why not some other compass? Why not some other compass to whatever it is that's going to get us into the afterlife? It just seems if you're using the predictive principle, it's absurd. But something else that just struck me watching that is he's just kind of asserting, I think unjustifiably, that it just doesn't make any sense to assume morality is tied. No, I think that would be kind of the baseline intuition, kind of like we just assume we have free will. We don't really need a credible argument for it. We just kind of assume there's a natural world out there. We don't need a good argument for it. Of course, I think there are good arguments for those things. But it seems to me he's trying to shift the burden of proof. I think if he's going to assume morality isn't tied to what gets you in the afterlife, I'm pretty sure the burden of proof would be on him. What do you think, David?
Yeah, honestly, what I was thinking, and this is what I was kind of pulling out when I was listening to that, when they were talking about conditions, is I was wondering, how we get to this idea of conditions for having a good afterlife as opposed to a bad one. So I was kind of thinking more along those lines of where it was kind of surprising to me that TJ grants that. If I was TJ, I feel like I would say, like, what if Calvinism is true and there are no conditions? But I would agree with you that, generally speaking, we believe what our senses, and I kind of agree with Joshua Rasmussen here that we don't just have our five senses, but that we also have a sense of reason, a sense of morality, and such, that we generally believe these. And TJ generally believes these because fact of the matter is you simply cannot prove that what you see is actually there. There's just not a way of proving that. So you have the choice: either you trust your senses or you do not. And so if we also have a sense that acting in a certain way is more moral, more pleasing to God, more likely to I'm gonna sound like I'm advocating work salvation here. But more likely to gain you a place in the afterlife. And just for the record, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm a Protestant. I believe in salvation by grace alone.
Exactly.
But if you feel like that there are good things that you should be doing, and I do affirm the possibility of apostasy. So how about we go with that? That a person who is not living a good way could fall away and ultimately not make it to a good afterlife. I'll make some of the Protestants happy by saying that. Then I would agree with you. It's best to trust your moral intuition there, because it seems inconsistent to me that you would trust what you're seeing is there, and what you're hearing, what you're feeling, even though you can't prove those. But then you're not going to trust your intuition that acting in a certain way is right and pleasing to God.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and yeah, not to go off on too much of a tangent there, but like even though you and I obviously agree that Christianity kind of reverses what most other religions teach, you do the works and then there's salvation. Christianity kind of reverses that and says, okay, you get saved first and then you want to do works. Even still, works are tied into the Christian religion because Jesus says, by their fruits you shall know them. Well, what are their fruits?
Yeah.
Their fruits are their works. So yeah, so even though we agree, obviously, grace has to come first, there's still an evaluation of the works there. And that goes, of course, even back to the Old Testament. Before God gives the Ten Commandments, he says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He saves them first from the land of Egypt through grace and then proceeds to give the Ten Commandments. So, obviously Jews and Christians disagree, but I would argue it's even back all the way there. And go off on that tangent, I forgot where I was going to go with that. Oh, right. I was going to say, again, and this is one of the things that atheists like to do with religious experience, where they like to say, oh, well, you can't use your religious experience can't be evidence of a God because look at the diversity of religious experiences, right? And I would say fair, but it seems to me that doesn't refute the point, because all you have to do is broaden the question to say, why do human beings have a capacity for religious experiences? Forget the diversity of them. Why do human beings have that capacity? It seems to me that very capacity in humanity seems to be evidence for a God, however you want to slice that down. And it seems to me the same thing is here. Even if you want to point to the diversity of methods that different religions have assigned to get to heaven, they all have to do with morality. Even the disagreements within themselves, it's all a moral principle. Again, even in Christianity, even though the works come second, it's still about moral works. So like these are the theories that all of humanity has come up with from the beginning of time, and he wants to just be able to throw that out and say like, well, no, it can be murder or picking your nose or whatever. And again, I just think he has the burden of proof to actually make an argument that would lead to the conclusion to that effect, and he can't just assert it. But
and I'm also wondering if we couldn't apply that a little more broadly. I mean, when we talk about doing different good moral works to ultimately have a better afterlife, we don't actually have to be able to know which specific moral works you would have to do we? In order to say that doing moral works on this view is more likely to lead you to a better afterlife. It doesn't seem to me that it's necessary to have the epistemic warrant for saying any particular good works are there. Would it not simply be enough to acknowledge that there are moral works that have to be done, and we can leave it as an open question as to what specific works they are? But it seems to me that even if we can't say which works there are and that they all have an equal probability, even if we grant that to TJ, that doesn't rule out that such morals exist. In fact, it seems to presuppose that they do.
Right. And to be fair to Tom, he is a moral realist. Now, of course, he believes the natural law can ground him with, which I think is highly improbable as an explanation. I don't think even in principle, I think morality by definition is a non-natural kind of phenomenon, but we can leave that aside. And let's see what I've got written down as far as timestamps here. We will continue with the video.
Yeah, also just to follow on that, I'm curious how he would square that with his denial of free will. How you can say people ought to do things when they can. But that's another issue.
Well, no, it's fine. Yeah, I actually had that written down because where he's going to say something to that effect later, and I was kind of waiting for it to come up. But yeah, you're right. I mean, he kind of always is going off. And keep in mind, Pascal's wager, by the way, is decision theory, as she's putting it. She's using it in the sense of decision theory, which he's granting. He's not even denying. So, I mean, the idea of making decisions, almost one might almost say it implies free will, but we can leave that until it comes up.
I mean, I guess some people think if God exists, God will have certain good attributes or something, like just or omnibenevolent or whatever. Maybe you just don't think. I mean, that's a conditional claim too, so an atheist could affirm that. It's just saying if God exists, God will be this particular way, or likely be this particular way, or be the greatest conceivable being, or something like that. So maybe you just think if God exists, we just have no idea what God's like, or something like. I don't know. Is that your view? Or?
Yes, pretty much. So from my perspective,
Okay.
all of the theistic arguments, like the ontological argument, the greatest possible being, and that it has some kind of moral nature to it, Anselm's arguments, and the pure act, and the objective morality, and omniscience, omnipotence, all of those things are just arbitrary things that we label it. And they may or may not apply at all. They could just pick a different property and say it has these properties. Like there are some that I would agree on. Like I think that there's a minimum requirement for a God, that it's like either eternal, all powerful, and necessary. If you got those three, you got a God essentially. But it doesn't need any consciousness or morality or any of the other properties attributed to it. And so as long as we have something that's one of those three or all of those three, that can act as a grounds for everything. And so granting that much really tells us nothing about what this God is like, or what it would accept or not accept into the heaven if there was potentially one.
Okay, so yeah, so I thought she made a fine argument. Now, of course, she's being very polite, very gracious towards him, and I no doubt because she's on his program, and it's the same approach I took, because she could easily be more forceful with that. She's kind of mere suggesting that most understandings of God would entail one that's omnibenevolent and all of this, and then he just comes up back with his typical thing. Well, he thinks most of the omni properties are made up. Now, he's going to get into this later. We'll see as we play the clip further. She gives an analogy to what he's talking about as far as different options equally being likely to get you into heaven. She's saying, okay, suppose you've applied for a bunch of different colleges, and say 4 or 5 of them approve you to come to their college. And let's say you have equal reasons for going to each one. That's kind of what you're saying. And then he comes back. He's the one who introduces, yes, but I might have additional arguments. I might have additional reasons I bring to the table that make one college preferable over the other. And of course, that's what's happening here. So even if you kind of start with his presupposition that all these different actions are equally likely to get you into heaven, it turns out you can actually introduce additional pieces of evidence, additional arguments, as she's pointing out, to use Anselm's argument, that God is the greatest conceivable being, that he's a moral being. And so if you bring these additional arguments to the table, it turns out that you actually can make certain options more probable, more likely to get you into heaven. And that's one thing I was going to talk about is Anselm's definition of God. Now, he says it's just made up, that the omni properties are made up. I think that's to just kind of arbitrarily disregard the thousands of years of development on these arguments, and the fact that people have, since Anselm, all the greatest philosophers have made these arguments more sophisticated. There are things that have convinced people like Ed Feser, who was at one time an atheist, who didn't find these arguments compelling, who actually came to find these arguments compelling. Like, I don't think these arguments have this kind of lasting effect if these old ancient Greeks just kind of made up omni properties with no justifiable warrant for it. And so, yeah, I do think if you have a proper conception of God, you don't even have to go with Christianity, right? You can just have arguments for God from the moral argument, even from Anselm's argument, that if you have the greatest conceivable being, and something like morality, by the way, goodness is not a made-up omni property, right? I've talked about this on the show before. You can't have ontological goodness on a par with ontological evil, because ontological evil isn't actually a category. It doesn't exist, right? Ontological goodness exists, and evil only exists as depravity or a lack in a good thing. So these are sophisticated arguments. I don't think they're made up. And I do think when you introduce these extra arguments, it does make it much, much more probable, even on top of the stuff we've already discussed, that good actions are going to get you into heaven.
Yeah, and 2 things stood out to me on it. First, it did seem kind of arbitrary to me that he was I forget which 3 he listed, but he basically listed 3 that you could have, and then said the rest of them are made up. I didn't hear any criteria for why we should be disregarding all of these 3. But even with the 3 that he listed, he said if you have these 3, you have a God, but then we don't have to assign to it intelligence or knowledge or something like that would traditionally be attributed to God. And my thought there was, okay, so let's work with that. If he's willing to grant all of that, that's actually a major concession to theism in my view. Like, if I got someone who's willing to grant me that there's an omnipotent eternal something, which for all we know could be intelligent, that's something I can work with right there, because sure. That's very mysterious on the center. And of course, I would just go to other arguments like teleological arguments and even I think a good cosmological argument that you can actually show that these actually have to have their origin in an intelligent being, or even like an argument from reason. I'm still trying to study up on the argument from reason because I find it a fascinating argument. But basically, there is really, in the absence of something with intelligence, something that's purely natural, we should not ourselves have intelligence, and yet we do. And so we can actually, like you're talking about, bringing in additional pieces of evidence, and I mean, here it is. If we want to just work with the hypothesis that he was willing to grant, I would be fine with that, and say, hey, like, let's see, can we then from other pieces of evidence actually deduce even more about this eternal, all-powerful thing? And for all we know, that it could also be intelligent and personal. He certainly hasn't given us any reason to think that it's not.
Yeah. And something we were talking off air, and I just was reminded of it as you were saying that stuff, is we can start with certain hypotheses and then make predictions on those hypotheses, right? So one of the things we're kind of discussing that's kind of been a common thread is, like, why would we have a moral compass if God valued us violating that moral compass? Like, okay, so there's a heaven, and we're supposed to violate the moral compass and murder people, or not even consult the moral compass at all. Maybe we just pick our noses on a Tuesday and get into heaven. And I'll try not to go off on too many tangents here. My mind is going a couple different places here. But the problem with those is you almost have a God who wants us to be confused about how to get into heaven, right? And as soon as you start saying you have a God who wants us to be confused or doesn't want us to know how to get into heaven, you're getting into an impersonal God who doesn't care. But if you have an impersonal God who doesn't care, there's not going to be a heaven, right? He just creates us. He doesn't want a relationship with us. And so he's just kind of watching, life play out, human history play out the way it's going to. But then, to me, if you have such an impersonal God, or such a jerk God, or as T. Jump's words, an evil God, this is a God who doesn't want a relationship with us. So he's not creating a heaven and setting up a criteria to get in there. So if you even start with the presupposition that there is a God and there is a heaven, meaning he wants a relationship with us, and so there's criteria to get into that heaven, there's going to be something built into humanity. And what our argument has been is it's the moral compass. And one thing that struck me there when you were talking about the teleological argument, and we also have intellect, is, of course, it's a Christian idea that we're made in the image of that God, but I think you don't even need the Bible for that. I mean, I think that can be something you can derive from arguments, is God has created beings who are kind of like him. And so, yes, I think insofar as he wants relationship with us, and there's going to be criteria to get into heaven, and we're like him, you're going to have the moral compass built into us, because that is supposed to lead us in the direction of getting to heaven. That's something tied into that is going to be the criteria to get in there.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with all that.
Yeah, and one other thing is, again, Josh Rasmussen does this, where you come up with theories that make predictions off them. If you had a God who wanted us to murder, like, build that into humanity, right? Like, if his criteria is he wants a relationship with us by having pick our nose on Tuesday, like, why hasn't any religious tradition ever come up with that, to pick your nose on Tuesday? Like, if that was the criteria, and God wanted it to be known to us, he wanted a relationship with us, that's going to pop up somewhere in religious traditions, somewhere throughout history. So so I have two more.
Now be honest, Stallman. You pick your nose on a Tuesday. God's a universalist, and he knew everyone would do it.
Yes. So yes, if you're making a prediction based on universalism, maybe T. Jump has a point. But again, the idea here is probability. I'm still going to say that's not probable. So yeah, these last two clips I'm going to play are the longest. The next one is roughly 2 minutes, and the one after that is 4 minutes. It's longer, but I've included them because I do think they're worth discussing. So let's go to those.
I mean, sure, but I do want to be clear on what the question, the relevant question is, and it's not what is God in fact like. It's what is most likely. What is God most likely like? Is it more likely that God rewards just people and doesn't reward, bad people? And I think you're just saying those are equally likely. So I don't want to make any claims about what God is in fact like. All you need for I guess a more interesting version of the wager to go through is just to think that it's slightly more likely that God would reward certain things and not reward other things. And I at least think it's maybe slightly more likely that Mother Teresa gets rewarded than Hitler, or that theists get rewarded than atheists. But again, there is a subjective nature to this argument, and if you're like, nope, theists and atheists, same probability, well, so it's interesting. If you say it's the same probability, then you're in a situation where actually being a theist and being an atheist have the same expected value for you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is similar to a situation like you go to an ice cream store and you equally like two flavors of ice cream, but you can only get one, right? Or if you want to have a more serious example, you're choosing between, like, you just applied to colleges and you're choosing between like Juilliard and like Yale, or like your career in law versus your career in music or whatever. And really they're in some sense equal, or at least on a par. They have the same expected value for you.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about these cases is that it's not at all clear which one you should pick for decision, like according to decision theory.
Well,
And
only
some
considering
people
those
say-
variables, then you would add in another variable
Mhm.
and say, which one do I like
Okay.
for this additional variable? For example, I would say I would pick atheism because I like rationality more, or what I consider to be rational, and I consider following the evidence wherever it leads and not believing things that don't have evidence. And so for that reason, even though both have an infinite reward or equal probability for the decision theory consequences metric, I would then choose atheism based on the rationality metric.
All right, so before we respond to that clip, I do want to introduce, we have Kyle Lander with us from Christian Idealism. A link to his YouTube channel is also in the description. Please go subscribe. Kyle, how you doing?
I'm good.
Yeah, so you caught the back end of that there. I'll kind of catch up. I don't know if you've watched the clip before coming
No,
on.
but I'm aware of the general concept that she's trying to get at.
Yeah, and so we've kind of addressed what's leading up to here now, and I have some notes so I don't forget what we're going to respond to that he just said. But basically his idea is he agrees with her on the wager insofar as if there's a heaven, we were best to wager living in such a way that would get us there. But then his argument is, because since we don't have any evidence to know what that God's like or what he wants, any action is equally as likely to get you into that heaven. So picking your nose on a Tuesday is as equally likely to get you into heaven as living a moral life, as is spending your life murdering people is as equally likely to get you. And so we've been talking about that, but I guess before we address the clip that just went on, did you have anything you want to say about that part?
Well, no, because, I mean, it seems like he's trying to attack it from an epistemic perspective, which that's not really the point of the wager in the first place. It's not an argument for God per se. It's more of like, if you were to look at the evidence, then it's better if this is the case rather than not. At least that's kind of my understanding. I mean, I don't like using Pascal's wager as an argument for God. It's more of a practical thing, right?
Yeah. And it's not, and she's not even using it that way.
Right.
She's just kind of saying, hey, if you think that there's any likelihood that there's an afterlife, and you think you value getting there and it's a good thing to get there, then maybe you should just wager on living a certain way that gets you there. And his response is, yeah, but there's no way to know what kind of life would get you there. And now he mentioned a couple things there. And so, Dave, we touched on this earlier, which is that it's not just you start with assumption of maybe there's a God and maybe there's an afterlife, but you can introduce extra arguments that will make certain options, certain lives we live, more probable to get you into heaven than not. And he just conceded that principle, while his whole argument up to this point has been that they're all equally likely, meaning he was ignoring that principle up until right now he introduces something. And so one thing that struck me that's almost kind of self-defeating about his principle, because keep in mind, we've been kind of playing on three options. Okay, so there's living a moral life, that might get you to heaven. There's picking your nose, amoral, right? And then there's living a murderous life, that might get you into heaven. But she brought up a concept that struck me as interesting, which is the idea of we have a kind of intuition that someone like Mother Teresa should be rewarded, whereas someone like Hitler should be punished. And that made me realize that it turns out you actually can't just assume that morality wouldn't get you into heaven, because if as soon as you say God values, quote unquote, picking your nose on Tuesday, and that's going to get you into heaven, all of a sudden picking your nose actually becomes a moral action. Because if God is valuing it and he's rewarding it, that means it's a moral action. So it actually turns out that no matter how you slice the argument, you can't actually get outside of morality being tied into what gets you into the afterlife. What do you think about that?
No, yeah, I would agree. At least if we're assuming that there is an afterlife, and that if there's judgment that happens based on moral actions, then yeah, I would agree with that principle. So
yeah, and he said, well, so I by the way, I like the dig at theism and at Christianity when he says, I'm going to choose atheism because I value rationality. I found that quite comical. But number one, he values rationality. So again, he sees a value in it. He sees it as moral to be rational. But, kind of, David, as you alluded to earlier, for someone who so vehemently argues against the existence of free will, how exactly do you get rationality?
Yeah, because rationality as an enterprise presupposes that you have the ability to choose and evaluate between competing truth claims. And if your rationality is leading you to the conclusion that you actually don't have a choice of what conclusion you end up with, then you seem to have a self-defeating epistemology there. Because on the one hand, the whole purpose of seeking truth presupposes that you really have the ability to find it among different competing claims. But then when you claim to have found it, you find out, oh, wait a second, I didn't actually have the ability to get here rationally. Now that I'm here, I had to be here. But then the problem with that is, of course, how can you really say that you're being rational? Because everybody, most determinists, I would think, are compatibilists. So, you're really just believing what you want to believe, because your beliefs and all your actions are completely determined by your desires. And so at the end of the day, you're really believing what you want to believe. And so, if you're believing it because you want to believe it, then, you could be telling yourself that you're believing it because it's actually true, but you just have no way of knowing it. So, I mean, in my view, determinism, compatibilism, all of it it's equally epistemologically unknowable. We have to presuppose libertarianism, at least at the epistemological level.
Yeah, I agree. And to me, and not to go off on too much of a tangent here, especially because we do want to end before 8:30. To me, it seems like it's almost impossible to make an argument against free will, because if you're not freely making the argument, there's no confidence it can possibly even be successful. So for all his argumentation that it's impossible that there's free will based on my argument, well, for all we know, it actually is rational. There is a possibility, but you're just predetermined to think we find the argument compelling. The whole thing is just outlandish to me. So this is the last clip I do want to play. This is the longest clip from it, but we'll play it and then we'll say our piece and then close out. Let me get it brought up here.
Okay, so the epistemic rationality thing is sort of like trumping for you, but you do admit that they both have equal expected value.
Yeah, with the argument I've presented, yeah, it's just purely equal. So it's other than the necessary, eternal, all-powerful thing, any additional property to whatever God may or may be like is equally as likely as its negation. So saying God would reward Mother Teresa is equally as likely as saying God would reward Hitler.
What?
No difference between those two from my perspective.
So, I mean, I'm just trying to kind of understand your position. One position that some people have is that what determines what you should believe is epistemic stuff like evidence or something, right? So, maybe like you said, you should be an atheist because given your evidence, that's like very likely, or your evidence strongly supports that, or whatever, right? But here's a separate question: how should I act? What decision should I make? And a lot of people think that's where decision theory comes in. And you could actually totally rationally believe atheism, but act like a theist. It's called what sometimes philosophers call acceptance. So you can believe atheism, but accept theism. Again, I'm not saying you should accept theism. It sounds like what you should accept is, it's like a coin flip between theism and atheism, because you think it's equally likely that theists go to hell or theists go to heaven than atheists go to heaven. But it is interesting that it's not obvious that you should, in addition to believing atheism, that you should accept atheism. It sounds like you should like flip a coin or something.
Well, I would reject that, because I would say that, for example, the likelihood of whatever actions are entailed in being a theist and acting like a theist are equally likely to get you into heaven as doing whatever the antithesis of those actions would be, and we would just label that as the atheist thing or whatever.
Well, sure, but I'm just saying then you're in the Juilliard, Yale, or chocolate ice cream, vanilla ice cream situation with respect to action. Not we're not talking about belief anymore. So
Right.
Should you act like a theist or act like an atheist? Well, it's a tie.
Right. That's why I would say that
Okay.
using decision theory, this is why I think that Pascal's wager doesn't work, because it's completely arbitrary. All of the possibilities are exactly equal, so we'd have to just dismiss Pascal's wager and decision theory on that basis and then come up with a new criteria. And that new criteria is the one we would use to decide what we should believe and how to act.
But yeah, okay. So you're just saying, but then you think the afterlife is almost irrelevant because we're completely in the dark about, how to maximize expected value in the afterlife. We are just 100%, we're total skeptics about that. So then you actually do think the afterlife is irrelevant and we should just think about.
Sort of. It's more like, if we grant that the afterlife is relevant, that alone doesn't tell us anything. Whatever would get us to the afterlife is what we should be doing, which I grant that. But without an additional feature to tell us what that is, it's totally not worth our consideration. We can just dismiss it and say, yes, that is a true statement. But until we have a further statement that explains what we should do, it's just irrelevant.
So, apart from all the additional arguments we've given, one might almost say that the additional argument is our moral compass. Like, that is what makes that door more likely. Again, this is something that didn't strike me until, because I've listened to this obviously a couple times before during the podcast, but doing this live and listening to it now, what struck me is you actually can't say there's an amoral thing that gets you into heaven, because if heaven is the reward for the action, that makes it the moral thing, right? And so if you have three doors that she's putting on, and he wants to say they're equally likely, you have door A, picking your nose gets you into heaven, door B, murdering people in your life gets you into heaven, or door C, doing all these moral things gets you into heaven. Well, none of them are amoral, because the reward being heaven makes it the moral thing to do. And so how do you know which one is most likely? By consulting our moral compass. That's how you know which one it is. And he just wants to disregard that and say they're all just as likely. I think she's right to push back on some of the things she does by saying, well, if we're just going to have this, kind of skepticism that just makes us ignore it, then like what's the point? You gentlemen may take it away.
Yeah, I kind of wonder what his moral philosophy is. To me, I'm more of a virtue ethicist, but I'm just wondering what morality, at least from a normative ethics standpoint, he holds to. Because if he's going to say that it's just equally as likely, that seems very counterintuitive. If you know what I mean.
The ethical view that I would hold, classical natural law theory, it would seem to follow from that. If that's correct, then that morality itself is an expression of how things ought to work in a designed system. And so within a designed system, when things are going according to their design, then it is right. And since a design is put in place, by the very purpose of a designer, it seems to just follow from that doing things that are right morally is more likely to secure you a place in heaven than doing things that are wrong.
Yeah, for me, I'm more of a non-natural moral realist. So I actually take Benjamin Blake Speedwalk. I can't pronounce his name correctly. His name is Benjamin Watkins, and he has a normative theory that basically says that morality reduces to rationality, and that's pretty much like irreducible. Now, of course, I can't make an argument for God from that, like David can, But I do, even then you have to use reasoning in order to come to moral truths, and that will include the moral truths of living a virtuous life. So I don't know what Tom Jump's view is on ethics, but he needs to. It seems like he needs to think about it more, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I guess before we close this out, one thing I want to say, and I'm not taking a dig at Tom here. Like he's a friend of mine. I've been on his show. He's been on mine. He's coming on my show again later this month. But the first ever time I talked to him, it almost felt like he was being deliberately slippery, like this whole idea of naturalistic pantheism can explain the evidence as well as God. It seemed like it was deliberately constructed to just avoid conclusions he doesn't like. Now I think people can argue with that. He can say that's not the case, but the reason I wanted to address the arguments he makes specifically in this video is because I think this highlights that is the case. If he's willing to say that within his worldview, it's just as likely that murdering people your whole life gets you into heaven as that's as likely as feeding the poor your whole life or living as a Mother Teresa. I think that just highlights that this is a good example of his epistemology is structured in such a way to avoid conclusions he doesn't like. Because keep in mind, Pascal's wager isn't even an argument for God's existence. It's just an argument that maybe you should behave as if God exists. And he dislikes even that conclusion so much that he's willing to say all these things are just as equally as likely. And I just
right. Well, I mean, it seems odd because no matter which approach he takes, if he accepts my theory of ethics or if he accepts David's theories of ethics, it seems like you kind of have to pragmatically accept that a God exists, even if that may not necessarily be the case. And that's kind of the whole point of Pascal Rager, is to live a moral life even if God doesn't exist. So even if you don't believe that God exists, you still accept it in the sense of okay, well, I'm going to live my life as if he does exist. So.
Yeah. And I think even his own concessions there, I think he made a lot of concessions without even realizing them, valuing reason, valuing rationality. These are things that we value because we were born in a place that is founded on modern Christendom. A lot of these things weren't considered values. Forgiveness wasn't considered a value for most of human history. Mercy wasn't considered a value. Things like rationality weren't considered a value. I mean, we only have science because of modern Christendom, right? People like to think that we were basically Stone Age idiots until the Enlightenment 500 years ago, and then man became rational, and they just ignore the complete Christian foundation that gave rise to that. But so even his concessions show that he lives as though, as Jordan Peterson would say, he lives as though God exists. So while simultaneously making the argument that you can't actually pick a way of living based on any probability, he's living as though God exists. And I think people make decisions for yourselves, but I think this is becoming more apparent. I think when Tom Jump first burst onto the scene, he was kind of like the Hoist Gracie of the atheism world. He had this kind of way of arguing, and I think even still it's effective to a point. People have a problem with it just because he's good at talking, he's good at debating, he's got a way with words, he's good at it. But I think people are starting to catch on to how his epistemology is structured just to avoid conclusions he doesn't like. And so we'll see how he does long term. Obviously, I wish him all the best, but we'll see how that plays out. So David Paulman, Faith Because of Reason, Kyle Lander, Christian Idealism. I have links to both your guys' channels in the description. Everybody go subscribe and click notifications because subscriptions don't mean a whole lot. But do you guys have anything you want to say before we go?
No, I'll just close out by agreeing that I think T-Jump's biggest problem is his epistemology, because I would have to talk to him more about it to confirm this, but I feel like it is geared much more towards avoiding theism than arriving at truth. And I think that is the problem. And I think his epistemology is really bad just to begin with. So that is where I really think that apologists need to fight T-Jump, is at the epistemological level. But I completely agree with you. It seems to be completely structured to avoid theism rather than to discover what is true.
Right, I would agree. It kind of it's built in a way that's anti-theistic, so it's not really built towards truth, like how we would build our epistemology on. It's built on specifically being anti It's kind of like it's like an atheistic version of presuppositionalism. So you have the presuppositionalists that'll make up their arguments and try to reach to Christian theism, and then Tom Jump has his epistemology that kind of is structured in a way that's anti-theistic, and follows his worldview rather than a Christian worldview. So yeah, I mean, he's basically like an atheistic version of presuppositionalism, in my opinion.
It's one heck of a lot less annoying than presupposition.
Well, yeah, I mean, and
Yeah.
he said to me on air before that he has no idea how naturalism could possibly ground free will, but if there was such a thing as free will, naturalism would ground it, not God. Like, he said that to me. He has no idea how it would happen, but it would still be just as likely as God. So I don't know. People do it that what you will. Tomorrow, Jonathan Pritchett will be live on my channel. John Dunphy will be with us.
That's my professor.
Nice. Yeah, we'll have Jonathan Pritchett on at 2 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be live, so if people want to come ask questions, I really appreciate you being there. And do you guys have anything coming up?
No, though I'm gonna actually message Tom Jump and see if I can talk to him on his channel, because I haven't actually talked to him yet. I'm one of the people that haven't. And then I'm working on a series. It's called Quantum Hermeticism, so you guys can check that out. But
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everybody have a great night. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow when we have Jonathan Pritchett on. And I appreciate you, David and Kyle. I appreciate you guys being here. And everyone have a good night.